Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. In the last part we reached Fireburg and now we're in the mine so we can free Reuben's father, Arian, from whatever boulder's blocking him. And now we got two new enemies. The red bone has 510 HP, 315 experience points, 12 gold, weak to water and curative type attacks, but it can put you to sleep. Nothing too much to worry about though. The zombie has 500 HP, 324 experience points, 12 gold, weak to curative type attacks, and Blizzard has another one. We can't really do anything about that for the moment. And they have a bit of a redundancy in them, and I think they actually have two paralyzing attacks, which you only really need the one, but hey, if you feel like you need it, right? There are going to be a lot of undead type enemies in this area in particular. There's some in the next as well, so feel free to use your life spell on them if you have any white charges left. You'll also be running into a good amount of the enemies from the battlefields, as usual. I'm not sure what I prefer, honestly, when it comes to enemy placement in this game, whether or not I like that they just put a lot of enemies in a row and then have spaces without them for a good while, or if they intersparse them. I lean towards the intersparsing just because that means, first off, more time between edits that won't murder my computer with how many I have in a row in some certain cases here. But I could see the purpose of having so many close together. Also, this place has a really interesting mechanic in those elevators, like the one I just went down. They are one-way elevators. You have to press the A button to use them. However, I find them interesting just in terms of the way they make the area spread out. Either way, now we have the Charm Claw, the upgrade to the Magic Claw, and that has a lot of status elements on it. That's Paralysis, Sleep, Silence, Poison, and Blind. Not the most useful for that. It's still useful because I believe it still raises your magic a good bit. But that could be theoretically useful. Out of all of those status ailments, the only one I could see being fairly useful is Blind. Just because, you might recall how I mentioned in the early half of the game, you have a really high, really low accuracy rate. Having the enemies feel the exact same way just feels nice. Though it feels like it's not as effective. Now, the thing is about this area in particular is that there are a lot of side paths that you don't need to go to. The only one you actually really theoretically would need to go to is the one for the Charm Claw. And even then, you don't need to do that. It's just highly recommended because having more powerful weapons is recommendable. Though something I'm not sure of, because I've never done it, is what happens if you actually skip a weapon. For instance, say I skipped the Charm Claw here and went later on to the point where you would get the third claw. I'm not sure what happens in that case, if it just gives you the second claw or if it actually will just skip to the third one. I've never had the time or patience to do that, so I'm not sure. Given just how set in stone events are in this game, I wouldn't be surprised if it just gave you the third type of the weapon outright if you skip the second one for some reason. However, I could also see reasoning for that actually still giving the second one in the case it works on an upgrade system more so than an actual, like, item system. Like, say, chests may be coded to give you the upgrade to whatever weapon type of that you have right now. That's actually the boss fight right there, but I want to ignore it, mostly so I can go up here and fight this red bone group. However, with that, I now have to walk around the entire area again because we're back near the Charm Claw cave, so let's go over here. And the boss for this area is the Djinn. 6,000 HP, 504 experience points, 15 gold. Resistant to fire, but no weaknesses otherwise. Has, namely, the ability to put you to sleep, and otherwise it just likes to use a lot of fire-type attacks. Main strategy for this fight is going to be, as you just saw, blizzarding the red bone just to get them out of the way, and then focusing your most powerful attacks on the Djinn. Thunder is the best spell for Benjamin damage-wise, just because wizard spells by default are stronger than most black magic. And plus, since it's the only one we have, might as well use it, right? Wizard spell charges are interesting, by the way, because in my experience, they're the ones the game gives you the least of, not only just by how your magic raises anyway, but also when you level up, if I recall correctly, magic spells are somewhat random in how you gain them. Like you might gain 3 black before 3 white or so on and so forth. And because of that, I usually have just zilch in terms of wizard spell charges, even by endgame at pretty low amounts. Though there is a technical way around that, but I'll talk more about that later. Now, something I've also never been quite certain about with this game is the critical hits and how they're determined. It feels like it's probably just luck, but sometimes I swear the game doesn't just say screw you. Either way, that's the end of the mine. The Djinn could be an annoying boss fight, but it's only really if you have any non-immunities to fire, like say you forgot to switch Ruben's immunities over. Indiana Jones? We're close enough to blow up the boulder. Dead. Stand back. You missed entirely, but you still somehow hit it. Okay. I hope there wasn't anyone in the way of that boulder. We did it. Ruben, I knew you'd save me. Please head home to Mom. Right, you two be careful. Benjamin, let's return to Fireburg. Now, something if I recall, I think I recall correctly, is that Arian's sprite is actually slightly a reused one. From Final Fantasy Legend 2, I believe? That's the sprite of the dad from that. Which, mind you, goes into something I should have brought up earlier. I believe a lot of the NPC sprites are reused in this game. Do you have 10 gold for a cup of coffee? What was the point of that dialogue? I don't even think he takes 10 gold, so what? And what I mean by NPCs, I mean the generic NPCs, not the key NPCs. I believe most of them are reused. And hey, the Wintry Temple! Not even Wintry Cave. Oh, I've really got that place's name wrong. But yeah, that Gemini crest is actually the only reason that the sealed temple is here. Kinda strange, but hey, I won't question anything too much anymore. Either way, time for our next battlefield, and it's a lot of the enemies we've seen before. Not too surprising, but hey, experience points are experience points, right? Blizzard is a spell I recommend using single targeted because, as I mentioned, I believe at the end of the last part, in this area in particular, single targeting spells are just going to be more effective because you'll more than likely kill them in one shot. There's this kind of weird lull at this point where your magic spells and the power they have combined with your own magic stat isn't quite enough to kill most enemies, which is kind of annoying, but oh well. Even in the next area, that's fixed somewhat. Either way, next new enemy is a ghost. 550 HP, 330 experience points, 12 gold. Resistant to water, so watch out there, as well as earth because they're technically considered floating. However, curative type attacks are very effective. Though it's worth mentioning, a lot of undead type enemies in this area have an attack called Didn't Do Anything, where they just skip their turn. As well, they can pull a Final Fantasy III slime in the later parts of that game and multiply. The ghosts can do this, as I believe can the zombies? And that could be theoretically annoying. However, they were at least smart, and I believe the multiplied enemies, rather, let's get those words out there, Kyle, do not give you any bonus experience points for gold. However, nice little bonus, they do multiply at the current HP they have, so say an enemy has 1 HP and they multiply, the next one will have 1 HP as well. So you don't have to worry too much about a regained enemy, about endless battles, rather. Oh, and also, if you physically attack them, there's a good chance you'll get confused. That's something I'm actually very in the vague with memory about in this game, is status effects that enemies can inflict you with if you just straight up physically attack them. A lot of undead enemies and some magic type enemies later on have that same kind of thing going on where they'll inflict a status ailment, namely confusion a lot of the time, but sometimes like stuff like sleep. Alright, let's head back to Fireburg and talk to Arian. Orion? I don't know. But let's also use the inn because I like to have my spell charge refilled, thank you. If there is something I have to say I like about this game compared to some other RPGs, the Tales of series comes to mind, and when it comes to the earlier entries here, your objective is never not clear here. Sometimes in those games you'll be like, where am I supposed to go? And then you have to wander around and you'll find it eventually, but it's kind of annoying in that regard. I forgot to tell you, the crystal files in the lava dome. It had to be here somewhere. It's kind of one thing I find odd about this world. Not only are the 4 quadrants so evenly spaced together, it feels like it's just a grid that someone threw together on a map, but we never really hear anything about what's going on farther out from the tower. I mean, I guess it really doesn't matter because Benjamin's quest is to get the crystals around the focus tower. But it's kind of one of those weird things that you notice when you get older. It's like, wow, that's pretty simple. Mine just like the entire game is. Alright, welcome to the Volcano, which is, as you might be able to tell, homes of some fire elemental enemies. However, not many are right here. But we do have two new enemies, Werewolf and the Nightmare. Werewolves have 555 HP, 354 experience points, 12 gold, weak to Blizzard. I believe they can do some stats anyway on you, but it's not really worth noting. And the Nightmares have 535 HP, 330 experience points, 12 gold. Resistant to fire, but weak to Blizzard, as well as another thing we don't have yet. They can put you to sleep, so watch out for that, as well as confuse you. The confusion is the more annoying thing in that instance. Always take out Nightmares first. But coming over here, we get White. It's the Holy Spell. It's our next Wizard-type spell, and it's automatically party targeting. So you have to worry about split damage off the front, but it's so powerful by this point that it doesn't really matter too much. Very useful on boss fights, though, I will say that. I'm not exactly sure if White in this game is considered a holy elemental spell, though. I think it's considered separate from the zombie-type spells, which Kieran's such a regarded as. Which is kind of strange, but what you gonna do? And, there was a battle there, but nothing to be seen. You might remember someone in Fireburg mentioned that we need to find a mask to be able to see in fog. This is that instance. In this area, enemies by default are invisible, similarly to the ice pyramid before we got the magic mirror about a minute into that place. However, the areas here are so wide open that you can actually avoid a good amount of the enemies in the fogged up areas. And even then, the mask is very late into this dungeon. Kind of so late that it makes you wonder why they even bothered in the first place, but you need to add something interesting, right? Though I admit, this place retroactively always reminded me of Mount Ordeals from Final Fantasy IV, as well as Mount Hams. I guess it's more accurate to say any of the mountain-type areas in 4. Because partnered with the way that they're laid out, with the way the background of the mountains is scrolling, it always just reminded me of them aesthetically. If you want to just progress outright in the area, you actually want to go up those stairs. However, I'm heading after the mask. You know, though, despite the kind of simplicity of some of these areas, one thing I actually have to give this game credit for that even some Zelda games doesn't get right is that throughout more or less the entire game, you still have to use a lot of your weapons in the field. Particularly the claw, I think, is what gets used the most, but that does better than some Zelda games where a lot of the dungeon items you use in that dungeon, use it for the boss, and then very rarely do you have to use it for puzzles outside of the dungeon itself, because they want to design the dungeon around the new item you get. It makes sense, but it makes things a bit weird when it comes to areas around the other dungeons. It's one thing that, despite some of the things it did differently from other Zelda games, I think Breath of the Wild did right, is that since it didn't have default dungeon items, you had to make do with what the Sheikah Slate had. And I found that really cool. Admittedly, it meant that some puzzles had very similar solutions, but at the same time, the rest of everything was so interesting, particularly with the way the shrines worked, that it just didn't really hurt the game at all. Admittedly, a weird thing though, but it also makes sense. When you get the mask, the fog doesn't actually clear off the screen, you just see where the enemies are, which makes sense because realistically what's happening is that Benjamin is seeing the place without fog, but we still can't. We just see where the enemies are for the sake of convenience. In a lot of ways, though, this game's soundtrack, now that I listen to some of the particular sound fonts more in depth, kind of reminds me of Battletoads. Particularly some of the, I think those aren't drums. Percussion, maybe? It sounds very Battletoads-esque to me. As well as Mega Man X. I can hear some of the Mega Man X guitar in there somewhere, I can tell you that for a fact. I'm trying to remember the name of the composer of this game. I think it was like Ryuji Sasai? I only know the guy's work from this and Legend 3. Though I think he did some other games for Square, like Treasure and Redress, I think was one of the games he did. Guy is a fantastic compositor. That doesn't sound like the right word, but it seems like narratively correct, you know what I mean? Either way, guy does good work. Either way, boss for this area is Medusa. 6,500 HP, 510 experience points, no gold, resistant to water, which can be kind of strange compared to everything else in the area. And get this, being Medusa, she can stone you, as well as paralyze you and poison you. She has a lot of style ailments at you. However, she's not that hard of a boss. As long as you get rid of the werewolves with like a physical attack from Ruben, which is all you really need to take one out, and the blizzard from Benjamin, all you need to do is physically attack her with Ruben and then use white on her, because that does a lot of damage. White, when used on a single target, might as well be a better Mega Grenade, honestly. Because from this point on, Mega Grenades are still powerful, but unless you're fighting something 1v1, you're not going to be doing much damage. Well, 2v1. You're not going to be doing much damage with them, comparatively. Because enemy HPs are always going to be rising, but being the most powerful grenades, and we still got a decent chunk left of the game, their damage is going to kind of fall behind, admittedly. And that's the end of the Volcano. Surprisingly short area, all things considered, with a lot of enemies in the way, admittedly. But that only allows us to access the Lava Dome, the real dungeon for this area. This place is long and has a lot of enemies. I would actually think that this is the longest dungeon in the game, so be prepared. Make sure you bring some items. Either way, with that, next enemy is the Hot Wings. 450 HP, 261 experience points, 9 gold. Get this, resistant to fire and earth. However, they are admittedly weak to something we don't have yet, as well as shoot-type attacks. However, I actually don't think we have any shoot-type attacks. I don't think the Mega Grenades are considered that, despite the fact you throw them. They can't cure themselves when they get low on HP enough, though. Now we have the Fang Pyres. 600 HP, 381 experience points, 15 gold, weak to fire in a fire area, which is kind of weird. They don't really have much they can do to you, though. I think everything they do just does plain damage. They might have something... Actually, wait, no, I think their Sonic Boom attack can inflict confusion, so which could be annoying. But otherwise, nothing too remarkable. Next up is the Adamant Turtle. Totally not an Adamantoise. 630 HP, 420 experience points, 15 gold. Resistant to fire, but they do take more damage from earth and axe type attacks, which is pretty useful. I do believe they can blind and paralyze you, though, so watch out for that. Now, something weird that this game does when it comes to the brown chests that contain, like, ammo or items, or use items, is that they all actually can be openable as long as you don't have max of the item. However, the amount that's within them will reduce. Like, say, it's a 3 cure potion chest. If I have 98 cure potions, it'll have 1 cure potion within it. Either way, next enemy is a ninja, 585 HP, 372 experience points, 12 gold, weak to blizzard, as well as something else we don't have yet, and shoot-type attacks, if I recall correctly. I believe they can put you to sleep, which could theoretically be annoying if they're in a large enough group, but otherwise they'll probably damage you so quickly that you'll just wake up immediately. I believe they also can inflict blind on you. In fact, I say that as I look at my characters and they are definitely blinded. That's admittedly a flaw with how I do enemy notes. I have to alt-tab away from my video editor, so I might miss some things going on occasionally. That just happens. Admittedly, I do like how simple the magic system is in this game, because it keeps things less cluttered when it comes to magic, at least. You don't have to scroll through like 6 spells to get to the one you need, and admittedly, that's only really a problem ever in the active time battle kind of Final Fantasy games, where you have to scroll through like 60 spells to get to Faraga or something. And even that Faraga is pretty high up usually. Either way, next enemy is the Steno. 630 HP, 432 experience points, 15 gold, weak to earth. And otherwise, I think she can just do anything that the Medusa could. Paralyze you, stone you. I think they can even, like, blind you? Either way, they can do status elements at you. And the next enemy is the Iflite. 660 HP, 420 experience points, 12 gold, resistant to fire, but weak to blizzard. They can put you to sleep, and that's about all that's really annoying about them. However, their name is interesting because their name is clearly supposed to be Ifrit. However, it was mistranslated. That does bring up the fact that this game actually was translated, even though it was developed for the US. In fact, in Japan, this is called Final Fantasy USA. Before I get more into that topic, though, we got Abzards. 666 HP, 420 experience points, 15 gold, resistant to earth, but weak to shoot-type attacks. Can silence you if you don't have silence protection by this point, as well as confuse you. The thing about this game's translation is, Ted Woolsey, the guy who made all those funny lines in Final Fantasy VI and translated quite a few Square games of the era, did make a script for the game, but they actually turned it down in favor of the one they were already had in progress, which is what we have here. So despite being a game developed for the States, it actually does have translation. And that translation could have issues every here and there. F-Light is the only case that immediately comes to mind, though, because otherwise they actually made a good effort with this game with keeping things fairly consistent. Also, this is a massive, massive enemies, so let's just take them all out at once I actually walk the right direction. Admittedly, this area, similarly to the mine, has a lot of areas that wrap around to each other, so it's very possible for you to find a much more efficient route through this place. Although, namely, that only really comes into play after we do this section, because compared to other dungeons thus far, there is decidedly something you have to do before you can access the boss fight. We need to go find a specific switch and press it. And because of that, you need to actively go out of your way through two separate pathways. Speaking of the switch, there it is. Once we step on it, that door opens. However, I should note, if I recall correctly, if you leave the area after pressing that, you do have to go through the entire thing just to press it again. Which isn't that annoying, but in the case you run low on healing items, I can see that potentially being very dangerous. Admittedly, I mentioned that this is basically the longest dungeon in the game earlier. Part of that is just because I go out of my way to fight every enemy that I see. Because in editing, I had to reduce this part down to, similarly to the last part even, from around an hour and 26 to, as you see, around 35 minutes now. A lot of that just came from random battles in this area, as well as sometimes after battle, I had to pause for a minute just to check my notes to see if I had the right direction in mind for where I had to go next. Because the admitted issue with this game's dungeons is that even though I think the design is well done, the visual sameness compared to some other areas makes things confusing, particularly in this area, because obviously it's a volcano, things are going to look a bit similar. I think my favorite area that's a volcano in a Final Fantasy game, though, is probably the Gulag Volcano from 9. Just because it has a good amount of interest going on, even though the dragons are random as all hell in that place. And now, Benjamin finally has a life spell. It's about damn time. So now in the case that our partner falls in battle, we don't have to worry about fighting alone from there on. Though admittedly, something I think I forgot to mention by this point about someone dying in battle. Say Benjamin dies in battle, he'll still get the experience points if the partner finishes the battle. And if a character dies in battle, and is still dead by the time the battle ends, they're revived after it with 1 HP. Sometimes I actually had to cut out me healing actually after battle because someone had no 1 HP. And that's admittedly something I like that the game does, even though it's fairly easy. Enemies do decent damage to you throughout, which can keep things admittedly somewhat more interesting in case you like to keep your heal spells in close quarters. Admittedly, no real reason to at this point because I have so many seeds in my inventory, but it helps. I think Fireburg, despite it being one of the longer areas if you go in one sitting like I did here too, does one thing right, and I think it has some of the highest enemy variety, even outside of the battlefields. Just because I think out of all the areas, this has the most individual dungeons, maybe tied for the next area. Though now that I think about it, I think every area at least has 3 dungeons, because Foresta had Level Forest, the Bone Dungeon, and actually that's about it, I think. Aquaria had the Winter Cave, Ice Cave, whatever, the Falls Basin, and the Ice Pyramid. This place has the Mine, the Volcano, and the Lava Dome. Yeah, that's about right. Either way, next new enemy is the Salamand. 640 HP, 411 experience points, 15 gold. They can poison you, which could be theoretically annoying. Resistant to fire, weak to blizzard, and that's about it. On the whole, now that I think about it, though, despite the enemies not being so individually, I think Fireburg might just be the hardest section of the game, purely because of the amount of enemies you fight, partnered with how long the areas are, compared to some other parts of the game. And, you know, that might be why it's my favorite part of the game, now that I think about it, too, just because, admittedly, while I like easy games, I have a lot of fun with them just because I like games no matter what they are. I can see why a lot of people are turned off by games that are really easy just because the amount of effort you put in versus the kind of catharsis you get from overcoming whatever challenges the game has are minimized when the game is that kind of easy. I just have fun just because I like games. Admittedly, don't get me wrong, even I have my limits with games I can tolerate and such. I'm looking at you, Shadow the Hedgehog. I hate you. But there's a reason I'm easier on some games than some other people are. Like, I can see the very little merit that Sonic Boom had. Rise of Lyric in particular, the 3DS games were fine. And I admittedly also just have my guilty pleasures when it comes to games. I'm looking at Sonic's campaign from Sonic 06 in particular. It's horrible, I know it is, but I still have fun with it just because it's the fun kind of broken when you're playing as Sonic. Not Shadow or Silver, that's just not good, but you know what I mean, right? Though, speaking of what I mean, and that's a bit of a stretch in terms of speaking of, I should add, I always felt that this is a game that probably could have benefited from a remake. Not one-to-one remake, I'm talking more of like the Resident Evil 1-ish kind of remake, where they keep the basic setup the same, but change up enough that it's actually, like, notable. Because, imagine they did this game, but did it right, or more correctly. Like, more in-depth characterization story, more in-depth and characterized battle mechanics, so on and so forth. But keep the setup the same, you know what I mean? Just so they could try and make the game not more competent, but more interesting to people. I think this game could have done really well with one of those, just because there is a lot of potential here that it just never quite reaches. It's like a stone's throw away from it, too, which is the kind of frustrating thing, admittedly. But I think this game could have done well with one of those, particularly on, like, WiiWare or 3DS. I think it would have been really at home at. Kind of like what they did to Final Fantasy Legend, actually, now that I think about it, because they gave that game a remake on mobile phones, and it was pretty good. Not Final Fantasy Legend, Final Fantasy Adventure. Though Final Fantasy, I think that all three of the Final Fantasy Legend games, as the Saga games they actually were, got remakes too, on the Japanese DS. Of course, I would only really care about the third game because Final Fantasy Legend 3 is my favorite out of those three, but yeah. Keep this in mind for later because I'm actually going to cut back there because I accidentally went the right way in the wrong order because I wanted to come down here first because not only is there that extra enemy, but there's a little trove of treasure down here. Once I finish it, I'm actually going to cut back to that area we were just at because obviously there's just a crap load of treasure down here. Obviously, since they're brown chests, it's not needed at all. In fact, it's crowding up my inventory at this point, but yeah, you might as well, right? Show off everything. Actually, I do wonder, though, if for the 100% category of the speedrun, because I never watched the speedrun, if 100% counts going for all brown chests. I could see that being the case. Either way, thankfully, we're almost done with the lava dome. This is the last room of the area, or at least the last room that actually matters. And we only have a few enemies in our way here. Thankfully, nothing really new. Though I'd have to question what this pathway's here for. There's nothing here. Just there to be dickish, huh? I always have to wonder whenever I see pathways like that don't lead to anything, if they're there because they planned something for it, or because they just want to make sure it wasn't a complete linear pathway. At this point, though, I do recommend healing up, because I think you may have been able to see him on screen for a moment there. We are at the boss of this area, so make sure you're all healed up. It's the end of the line for you. Boss of this area is the Dual Head Hydra. Kind of a strange name if you ask me, but oh well. 14,000 HP, 429 experience points, no gold, resistant to fire, of course, and no actual weaknesses. However, he can paralyze you, poison you, as well as, I believe, petrify you, which is the really annoying thing there, because the only way around petrification, or paralysis at that point, really, is using the heal spell. Aside from the immunities that you might be able to have. Otherwise, I think Keely has damaging attacks that are just decent in damage. Holy and physical attacks between Benjamin and Ruben are going to be your best bet at healing when necessary. When you run out of wizard charges, though, for white, I recommend using the Mega Grenades, just because they are your most damaging weapon at this point, although the upgraded axe could also be fairly useful. Have to say, though, I think that HP jump is a bit ridiculous, because even the most recent major boss fight, the Ice Golem, only had 6,500. I realized that the previous two bosses with the Medusa and the Jinn had around that much anyway, but to go from that to 14k is a bit of a jump. HP spongy, to say the least. Especially with the damage potential we have right now. Even though, admittedly, the white spell can do a decent chunk all the same, I feel like they could have been safer with around 12,000, given the way the curve of the game has been thus far. At the same time, though, once you start getting the wizard spells, it also makes sense for the enemies to start getting spongy, because the wizard spells, particularly white onwards, just do so much damage that I guess they felt like they needed to make the enemies have higher HP counts than they probably should have, just so they actually feel like boss fights and not just glorified standard encounters. It's one of those pesky balance things where you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, you know what I mean? I think, as you may have noticed, I'm actually using the life spell with Ruben just because, given the white spell, it just makes sense for him to be the healer. Even if you have to do the unorthodox way, I'm using the life spell to fully restore your HP. Also, I love the sprite work for the dragon. Mind you, the enemy sprite work in this game is very expressive, and I love it. The added damage sprites does admittedly help with that. At the end of the day, though, it's just another boss fight. As long as you keep up the damage, you should be fairly fine. That is the downfall of this game, is that because there's no extra things like haste or active time gauge to keep up with, the game is immediately less interesting than things like Final Fantasy IV because of that. And that should be our third crystal restored. There you are. With that, I guess there's only one quadrant of the world left, one for each crystal after all. We did it! There's one crystal left to go. I remember a person from Windia saying something about a crystal. India? Where's that? To the southeast of the Focus Tower. Oh, no. I'm sorry for any creatures that were in those mountains. You're kind of dead now. Though, I find the inclusion of what that does there very strange. By the way, get the sun coin. You need that to get to the Focus Tower, of course. Because that eruption actually has a physical purpose. When we get back to the world map, we'll see it carved a path out from the mountains, which allows us to get to this battlefield over here, yes. But it also opens up a pathway all the way back to Aquaria. There is no reason for that shortcut to Aquaria, by the way, because there's nothing you have to do that goes between the two areas. But we do have this battlefield here, which is potentially the hardest battlefield in the game, because there's a lot of Thanos in here, and their love of status ailments. Those status ailments, namely stone, is what makes this place kind of annoying. Quake is going to be your best way through it, though. There's also some inflates in here, but overall, nothing too impactful. I also want to say that Fireburg's probably where you get potentially some of your most important level gains, because not only do you breach 1000 HP, but it's where you start to have enough magic spells that it's probably going to be your main source of attack for them, as long as you use it in between minor dungeons. Because you start to get a lot of black magic spells, in my experience by this point. Wizard spells too, but that's just because that only aids it, rather, because that means you just have 2 more sources of damage, really. And for clearing this battlefield, we get experience points. Either way, with the Crystal of Fire now restored, there's no more earthquakes between areas, which isn't good just because it's less annoying. So let's check out Fireburg and go talk to Arian just to make sure we're all cleared up here. Also, I'm gonna cut out me using the inn just because no need to see that. Thanks, Arian made it back. You said that earlier. After that eruption, the earthquake stopped. Cool. Either way, with that, let's actually head on out of Fireburg and head on back to the Focus Tower. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 5, we'll be going to the Focus Tower once again and making our progress into the 4th region of the game, Windia. See you guys then.